And it's actually through this workshop that we got to know, we got in touch with him through one of your classmates, Mukil, who's with you here today. He is a resource person with the Archaeological Survey of India, and his research focuses on the ancient Dravidian temple architecture, and it's based on traditional texts, Sanskrit texts on science and philosophy, is known as Agamas and Vastu Granthas, as well as the study of scriptures and iconography based on ancient Indian texts. He has presented more than 50 research papers at various seminars and symposia. He has delivered lectures on archaeology, on music, on mythology in various institutions and organizations. Dr. Manoj's interests include Kannada and Sanskrit literature, inscription and manuscripts. He is a multilingualist. He has written several compositions in Sanskrit, in Kannada, in Telugu, and in Tamil. These are all languages from the south, for those of you who are not very familiar with these languages. So without any delay, I would take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Kundana. Please, we would love to hear your words and learn a little bit more about Indian. Thank you so much.
So can I continue with my...
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Namaste to everybody. Today I have been asked to talk about the symbolism of the temple plan, comparing it with the human physiology. So before entering into the direct topic, previously I presumed that the students would be from the Amrita campus, so that they would be familiar with some of the scriptural aspects like Tantra and our Sanskrit Agamas. So I thought I can just jump into the topic. But from what I heard from the introduction, there may be people who are not very familiar with the scriptures. So I may need to give a small introduction regarding what these Vastu Granthas are primarily, and about the temple building activity, how it is done. And one major thing we have to observe in the traditional Indian context is that for us, we do not have totally separate branches unrelated to each other. Any branch of knowledge would be directly or indirectly related to the other branch. So it is not like, at least from what the Western education we are getting today, a person who is studying physics or chemistry or arithmetic, he need not have knowledge in Sanskrit or literature or something else. So natural sciences are totally separated from the so-called humanities, or however you label them in the contemporary days. But in Indian field, it has never been like that. Any literature or any branch of knowledge, we can see that it is either directly or indirectly linked with various other branches. This is one thing which primarily people should understand. The second thing is, while discussing the scriptural texts of ancient India, so as we all know, most of them are written in Sanskrit. So while translating these texts, many of the scholars, maybe Indian or Western, they go through the dictionaries, find the meaning, and translate it. It would be a verbatim translation. There arises a small problem in this way of translating texts. Because what happens, there may be certain terms which may have one particular meaning in one branch of knowledge, but it may carry a slightly different meaning in some other branch. So, applying the meaning, understanding the etymology, and relating it to the text is very essential while discussing our Indian Shastras and the Granthas. So, like this, one of the branches of knowledge in India has been Vastu Shastra. Ancient Vastu Shastra is quite different from the what the Vastu is being discussed in the modern days on the televisions and other medias. Because many of the things which they talk in the modern days, I really don't know from where they derive it. It is full of dogma and other, such unwanted aspects with it. But our Vastu Granthas are basically very, very logical and very practical in their application. They do not just make statements with some whims or some fancies, and they take into consideration so many things. So, while making a statement or while telling something, they have a set of rules and norms, and they also mention whenever it is necessary, wherever it is necessary, it can be amended, it can be changed. There is something which may not be, certain things are not very universal. So therefore, you can adopt certain things based on the requirement, based on the region and all those things. So Vastu Granthas are the Granthas which talk about, architecture basically. Now, I'll give a small introduction about what these Vastu Granthas are and what their forms. Basically, they are treated as an architecture. It is a very broad definition. But in the text, what do they deal with? Is it all religious? It is not all that religious. It talks about town planning, planning of the village. Then you have, houses, residences of common people, residences of the royal people, palaces. And it is not just royal people, doesn't just mean a royal family. In even that, there are a lot of categories, like the emperor, the king, the prince, the queens, the chief queen, and all these, like various categories of royal retinue, and all these things are discussed in detail. But the first and foremost emphasis they give to is temple building, because there are two reasons. The primary reason is temple has always been a very important part of the Indian society. It was once the nucleus of the entire social activity which used to happen. So the religious purpose of just going to the temple, having the darshan or prasad, no, this was not the concept. It involved a lot of socio-economic activities, political activities, legal activities. There were some ceremonies, customs, rituals, everything associated with the temple. So temple actually was the center of the entire human life in and around the society in those days. Of course, in the modern days, it has totally lost its essence for various factors. But this was not so. So the primary reason was a temple was in a village. If a village had a temple, it meant that all the activities could happen there itself. They did not go in search of anything for, like maybe a small banking business from that to this thing. The second aspect is the most important aspect, which is giving solace to the people. It was the divine residence. It was built for the people. See, in all times, there are two categories of people which we have to accept. One, there have been people who attain a self-realization and they can understand the spiritual path and they will know what the truth of life is. That is their blessed souls. But not everybody is like that. And always in all times, the proportion of people who are enlightened are less compared to the majority of the population. So now if a person is capable of engaging himself in spiritual activities like tapasya, japam, or various dhyanam, and where there are various margas in our Indian Indian way, in Sanatana Dharma, to realize God or self-realization. That is the major thing. So, but though there are so many margas, there are other people who either they are not capable of choosing such a marga, or they have their own limitations, which probably does not contribute for this aspect of becoming very inward and spiritual. But they also need solace. They also need some strength. They also need what we call as the Chaitanya of the God. So, to give this Chaitanya to the common people, the temples were planned, devised, and run by the the knowledgeable rishis of those days. So, temples in the modern days, many times people talk very lightly about the temples, as they have been very commercialized and all those things. Partiality is also very fact, and nowadays, unfortunately, even the people who are associated with the temple, the prayers and rituals, they do not have such a pious lifestyle as our ancient Indian had, or they guided. But we will hope, because it's always a cyclic in nature and time in Indian context. So we can always have this hope that someday the ancient glory will be regained. Now it is in some deterioration phase, and it will again go to its original glory. So with this, now, with this aspect, with this importance, a temple had to be built with a lot of dedication, and they had to be very cautious while making decisions. Just not for in the structural aspect, even in the philosophical aspect, in the spiritual aspect, they had to take a lot of caution, because who would be the deity who is installed there? What would be the votive concept of the image there? Then what are the mantras that have to be initiated? What are the rituals that a person has to install, has to follow? So all these had to be elaborated. Now, Vastu Granthas are basically texts which talk about the structural aspect, and of course they do touch the spiritual aspect also in the beginning, but not very elaborately. To fulfill this requirement, we have another set of Granthas referred to as Agamas. Agamas are a branch of Vedas itself, where the ritualistic part of the Vedas are condensed and translated for suiting the temple culture. To just quote an example. For example, there is some ishti. Ishti means an yajna which is performed with some intention. So when an ishti is conducted, the Brahmanas and Aranyakas mention the list of do's and don'ts, list of the material required. You may have the number of bricks to build the Homa Kunda. You may have the other count of Vritriks who has to partake, the number of days it has to be performed. So all these rules are laid in Brahmanas and other Granthas with regards to the yajna activity in a temple. In the general society. Likewise, Agamas have taken the essence of these yajnas and the fruits which a common person can acquire from that particular yajna, and they have given a ritualistic framework for it to suit the temple activity. So that is how a various forms of rituals and rites are seen in the Indian temples being performed, and this has to be frequently done to energize the votive sculpture and keep it in full Chaitanya throughout, so that whenever the people come, they are always blessed with that Chaitanya. It should be a perennial source. It shouldn't be something like this thing. So to fulfill this, lot of stress was laid, and Agamas became the guidebooks for the rituals is part of the temple building. So agamas usually have 4 parts in them. The first part is the Charyapada, the second part is Kriyapada, the third part is the Jnana Kanda, and the fourth part would be the Yoga Kanda. So as the terms they themselves mention, Charyapada usually deals with all the rites, proportions, how huge a temple should be, depending on the devotee's culture, depending on the capacity of the yajamana who is, who stands to build the temple, with all these things. So that becomes the kriyapada, and what are the adjuncts of the temple, what is the purpose of each and every adjunct. All these things are described in a kriyapada. Then we have jnanakanda. Now, as I said, once the commoners start going to the temple with complete dedication and they have this ritualistic routine, gradually, many a times, for many people, this continuous practice of the ritualistic temple visit will result in some amount of knowledge, and they will get an urge for self-realization. So Jnanakanda is that part which initiates people into this path and guides them what are the things to be taken. Then comes the Yogapada. Yoga, as today almost all the world talks about yoga and knows about yoga, but again it limits itself to the physical exercise part of the yoga and not the complete the metaphysical and the spiritual part of yoga. So Yoga Pada usually describes the method to win over one's self through the yoga sadhana. So these are the 4 parts of an agama. And with this, I think you all have got an idea of what Vastu Shastra Granthas are and what the agamas are. Now, as I said, both these are related to the temple architecture. They discuss it. They give in great detail about all the religious and ritualistic aspects of the temple. Am I audible? I think somebody must respond.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Sir.
It's very clear.
I can hear you very well.
So, now...
Sure, very clear.
Pardon?
Sure, yeah, very clear, sir.
Okay, thank you. I'll continue. Now, so with this, the structure of this temple is something which is visible to our eyes. We can see the temple in its structural form. But before the construction begins, there are a lot of rituals done, beginning from the selection of the bhumi, or the ground in which the temple has to be built. But as I have to concentrate only on the symbolism with the human body, I will not go into all those details, but restrict myself to this aspect. So when these rituals are being conducted, here we have to understand one thing. Usually, there are 3 kinds of shariras. One is the sthula sharira, the second one is the sukshma sharira, and the third one is the karana sharira. Now we will keep karana sharira aside for some time and we will just try to know what the sthula sharira and sukshma sharira are. Sthula sharira is that body which is visible to the eye, what we see. So that is the sthula sharira. Now the body which possesses all the organs, we have our hands, chest, body. This is the sthula sharira. Sukshma sharira is that which cannot be seen to the naked eyes, but it can be experienced. And the people who practice yoga in the correct sense are the best people who can explain what these experience. Everybody will have one kind or the other experience, but not many will realize that this is the activity of the Sukshma Sharira. So Sukshma Sharira is that which is guided by our mind and the Gnanendriyas, as we call it, and all the tantric aspects like the chakras and other things which are discussed greatly, they all fall under the Sukshma Sharira category. So here what happens, that is why many a times some people, they'll not get very easily convinced that if we say that through the proper control of the Sukshma Sharira, our Sthula Sharira can be completely maintained. Many people do not realize that because they open only to the Sthula Sharira. Likewise, the temple is the Sthula Sharira. The structure of the temple, what we see, is the Sthula Sharira. But there is a Sukshma Sharira which is associated with this temple. That Sukshma Sharira is the one of the Vastu Purusha. So here, when we are talking about Vastu Purusha, or when we give some definitions, you have to mainly try to grasp only the symbolism of it, and you should not try to relate it to a very physical approach. For example, if I say that this particular part is this organ of Vastu Purusha, we must not get into mind, so what about his limbs, what about his feet? No, these are not the form which you should think of in your mind. This is purely the Sukshma Tattva of the temple, which actually gives that energy to the temple. So the Sukshma Sharira of the Vastu Purusha is discussed in various texts. So it is not only from Mayamata or from Kashyap Shilpa Shastra or anything like that. Even Puranas like Agni Purana and Garuda Purana, they mention about this Sukshma aspect of it. So, so in this Sukshma aspect, the temple, before beginning the Garbhanyasa, as it is called, Garbhanyasa means the laying of the foundation pit on the selected ground for the temple. They will decide the place where the Garbhagriha is built. So that would be the most sanctified place with all the qualities required. And once that Garbhagriha point is decided, which invariably will be in the center part of the selected ground. That is invariably the center. There are rare cases where they come to, they move a bit towards one of the prakaras, but however, it is invariably the center part, and there are concentric prakaras built and developed around the Garbhagriha. So after the selection of that part, now a square is drawn and the Vastu Purusha is installed in that. While doing this, the explanation given is usually, even Garuda Purana says the same, Kashyapa Shilpa Shastra says the same. There are many granthas which they say the same thing. It is the head of the Vastu Purusha will be to the Ishanya. So once the head is to the Ishanya, naturally the feet has to come to the Nairitya. And to the Agneya and Vayavya are spread his arms and knees. So this is the definition given of the Vastu Purusha in the Vastu Mandala selected for the Garbhagriha. So here what we have to understand is, here we have to observe one thing. They have not selected the 4 cardinal directions for this. They select the Ishanya. Ishanya is the most auspicious corner because north is usually considered as the residing part of the celestial denizens. Therefore, Ishanya is the place where the Lord himself resides. That is why it has got the name Ishanya. So that is the most sacred part. So Ishanya is the where the Uttamanga, the head is usually referred to as Uttamanga to denote that the brain is here. So the work with the help of our Buddhi Shakti has to be conducted in that part. Therefore, so Ishanya, the head has to be there. So when the head is on the Ishanya, the Nairitya, the feet are there. That shows the stability. Then you have the limbs spread around Agneya and Vayavya. So these are all the tattvas which are very much required. And this Vastu Purusha is also related with the Vastoshpati. And Vastoshpati sometimes is identified with Indra, but major identification of Vastoshpati is with the Vishwakarma. Now, why I am telling all these things is, we have to understand that the terms Vishwakarma and Vastoshpati, we have to concentrate. Vastoshpati means a person who is the lord of a vastu or a place which is selected for this sanctified activity. When Vishwakarma, we have the Puranic picture of Vishwakarma is the sculptor, that is okay. But the term Vishwakarma also denotes that he is the creator of the Vishwa. Karma is in action. So he has done the action of creating. He is the Kartru for this Vishwa. So here Vishwakarma is associated with the activity of creation. So the creation becomes, the activity of the Brahma. Therefore, in this Vastu Mandala, the central portion is considered as the sthana of Brahma. And this is where we have to install the deity. Why there should be the question. Because as we said, the entire creation starts from there. Where was Brahma, where did Brahma actually emerge from? It was from the Nabhi or the navel lotus of Vishnu. So this Vastoshpati, or the person who is responsible for the creator of the entire earth, he is symbolically drawn and represented on the square where the Garbhagriha is built. And there in the center, the identification of Brahma or the Nabhi is done. Now here, when I am telling Nabhi, when I am telling head, no, it is not like you should have the imagination of a proper head. No, it is the Buddhi Shakti. It is the Shakti. It is the Kriya Shakti which are acting there. So what are these three Shaktis which I mentioned now? Buddhi Shakti is the intellect part. Ichcha Shakti is the wish to achieve that, what we have that goal. And with this Ichcha and Buddhi or the Jnana, we will have to have action. If you just have Ichcha, it is not enough. So we need to have action, and action is instigated by Agni. So these are all the aspects which symbolize these things where Vastu Purusha is identified. Now, this is one part. Another thing you have to have in mind is Vastu Purusha is not just who is represented in the Garbhanyasa. Again, the Agamas talk about Vastu Purusha and the ground plan and the elevation, both the ways. So the elevation part, it is called as the Prasada Purusha, and the ground plan part is called as the Vastu Purusha. Now, if you have this physical concept in mind, this becomes very confusing, right? How can one Vastu Purusha, again and again, how many Vastu Purushas? That confusion is there. So it is only the Sukshma part or the Tattva which is acting here. So the concept and the symbolism has to be understood. So while the Vastu Purusha in the ground plan is depicted, he is shown as lying down. Can I just take a break for a minute?
Yes, of course.
Can somebody guide how to add a PP to it? I just want to show you 2 slides.
So please try now. You'll be able to share. Share
I'll just
screen. Yes.
share screen. Yes. Yes. Is this thing visible?
Not yet.
Okay, I have got it on my screen.
We can see that you've started sharing screen, but still, okay. It's on. Yes, sir, can see.
So this would be a bit better. The picture is clearly visible, right?
Yes, yes, it is.
Yes, we can see. It's clear.
So now we come to the ground plan and elevation of the temple. Now see, this is the Prasada Purusha in the elevation. This is the Vastu Purusha on the ground plan. Now, as you can see that here the complete physical parts of the body is not shown. It is only the Sukshma Sharira which works here. Now, what happens is, in the Garbhanyasa time, during the beginning of the construction of a temple, this is the Garbhagriha, where the Vastu Purusha, about whom till now I was explaining, would be initiated and his energy would be installed there. So, Nabhi would be the center part of this Garbhagriha. Now, there is, by beginning the structure, they will have something called as the Nidhi Kalasha placed inside the Garbhanyasa. Before installing the everybody must be knowing that beneath the votive sculpture, there will always be 1 or 4 or 5 kalashas according to the tradition, custom of the region. They vary in number. However, there will be kalasha which is referred to as Nidhi Kalasha. And here Nidhi always need not mean only the monetary aspect. It is also the general prosperity, like even the grains and cereals, the dhanyas, they are considered as Nidhi. So therefore there may be a kalasha with dhanyas, manikyas, or precious stones, emeralds, gems and all these things. They would be placed in the Nidhi Kalasha. Now, why is it necessary is, the Garbhagriha, the votive sculpture, is intended to spread the energy to the devotees who come to visit. So therefore, naturally, it is the sthiti part which is happening, protection, sthiti karaka. So sthiti, the concept of sthiti is basically associated with Vishnu, and for protection, what are the things needed? It is a proper prosperity which helps to stabilize this thing. So Nidhi Kalasha will be always placed in the Garbhanyasa or the Brahma part, that is the Nabhi of the Vastu Purusha. Now, wherever this Nidhi Kalasha is placed, that must be just above the Bhrumadhya, or the place between the eyebrows of the Vastu Purusha. That is what it is said. See, this is the Vastu Purusha lying down, and you can see the Garbhanyasa is directly, so it comes between the eyebrows of the Vastu Purusha. So this is one Kalasha. Now we will just keep it in mind and then proceed. Now, as the structure goes above, there is another Kalasha which is placed on the top, and it is called the Amrita Kalasha. And when the structure reaches above, it is called as the Prasada. Many a times, see this part from the basement till the tip here is called as the Vimana. This part, that is from above the entablature till the tip, is called as the Prasada. So it is the Bhuvarga and the Prasada Varga. Now, until the Prasada, this structure, there is a Kalasha on the tip. Now, once when the elevation is taken above, I will talk about the other symbolism later on, but now we will understand these two Kalashas. So this Amrita Kalasha, which is on the top, which is the finial of the temple, must is considered as the Bhrumadhya, or the space between the eyebrows of the Prasada Purusha. Now, we can see that stress is laid upon Bhrumadhya of both the Vastu Purusha and the Prasada Purusha. Why this Bhrumadhya in particular? Here, this is where we have to understand the Sukshma and the spiritual aspect of the temple. Now, if there are some sadhakas into the Tantra, or if there are people who are familiar with Shat Chakras, they would know what this Bhrumadhya, or the space between the eyebrows, mean. Of the Shat Chakras, the sixth one and the Ajna Chakra, which is the path to knowledge, is called as the situated between the eyebrows. And when that gets energized and then that gets activated, that is when the so-called Jnana Chakshu, or the third eye, gets open for the sadhaka. So therefore, this Kalasha, which is also called as Amrita Kalasha, or the symbolism of nectar or ambrosia, is stationed in between the eyebrows of a sadhaka. Therefore, the Amrita Kalasha of the temple is the eyebrow of the Vastu Purusha and the Prasada Purusha. And once the sadhaka reaches this Ajna Chakra and he gets energized by that, there will be a flow of nectar that is called as Sudha or Amrita Dhara inside, and this is for a sadhaka. Now the same what do we call the krama, or the activity, is described by describing this part. That is why the female is associated with not with the head or the crown, but the eyebrows of the Prasada Purusha. So therefore we have to understand it is the Sukshma Sharira of the Prasada Purusha and the Vastu Purusha, and it only symbolizes the activity of that particular part. So therefore, this part, of the Amrita Kalasha and Nidhi Kalasha, both located in between the eyebrows of the Vastu Purusha and Prasada Purusha, shows that this is actually a tantric interpretation of the energy which gets built in a temple. So this is how, and that is why in many temples, if you see, the entire superstructure will be hollow. So this is the explanation given in the Agamas while described in the form. Now, next comes the Hrid Bhaga, or the chest or the heart part, which is usually associated on the ground plan with the Godamantapa or the assembly hall. So you can see this part. Now, why does that become heart? Means in a human body, the heart draws the blood and pumps it out. So it takes in and gives out. Now, this part of the assembly hall where people, they gather for the grace of the God, they receive what emits out from the Garbhagriha, and that has to, have its movement in around this assembly hall. Next, in the ground plan, Nabhi, or the navel part, is usually the Balipita. And Balipita is the offerings which we give to the various deities, various forms of energy, because what happens is, Devas are usually not people who consume materialistic food or whatever. They are only sattvagrahis. They only take the essence of what we offer. So the essence of a pure, purified rice or any offering which has been sanctified through the Vedic chanting is offered for the Deva. So who are these Devas? Devas are not those who are the supreme beings or the Brahman himself. They are the supreme, they are the, the celestial beings who are above the human level and who are capable of bestowing good Chaitanya to us by taking good Chaitanya from us. So what we give, they take it and they, it is like, that is why they're described as the clouds. Clouds, it collects, the clouds are formed. Sun collects water from the ocean, converts into clouds and then pours it back to the earth. So Devas are such celestial beings. So that is how the Bali becomes the Nabhi. And then we have the Garuda Stambha, or the major Dvajastambha of a temple, which is actually identified as the reproductive organ of a male. So it is usually compared with the phallus. Now, why phallus? Some people may just get an aversion with this usage of it. This is because even again in Tantra Shastra and Yoga Shastra, the virya which is produced in a body by a sadhaka is supposed to be very, very, very energetic and the source of Chaitanya, and it is innumerable times more possesses with energy when compared to our blood or other whatever things which we say, it supplies vitamins and that, this and all those things. But so a person who can withhold his virya without spending it. Virya is actually the Sanskrit term for a semen. So if a person, a sadhaka, can withhold that energy inside himself, then he will have the glow. So this is why the yogis, they never get, they don't have this fear for old age or death, jara mrityu, they're above it. So that not losing the energy and retaining the entire energy in us is the main intention of a sadhaka, should be the main intention of a sadhaka. So therefore, this Dvajastambha, which stands as a representation, is to show that you should not let away your virya. So this is the energy of the Vastu Purusha. How did the Vastu Purusha get the energy? It is through the rituals and puja. That is why there is a saying in Sanskrit, Archakasya prabhavena shila bhavati shankara. It is because of the prabhava or the influence of the Archaka, which can turn even a stone into God. It would be an ordinary stone if it is placed outside. But once it resides and when it has this ritualistic bath and other oblations made, then it gains that energy. So therefore, with all these rituals, whatever the energy the Vastu Purusha has gained from these activities, that is what stands as the symbol of this eternal energy as the Dvajastambha. And Dvajastambha also, withholds and collects energy which comes out of the prasada. See, these are all the sukshma part of the temple, which are not visible to the naked eye. So if I tell, many people may not be, they may not be able to accept these things. So next, while discussing the body, the griva part of the temple, or the amalaka, is usually referred to as the neck of the Vastu Purusha. So why neck? Neck is the one which withholds our Uttamanga. It gives support to the brain, which is the center of all activities. So to give you the good thought, good process and everything, you have to have a very good, buddhi shakti or intellect. So to get this intellect, the shikhara or the amalaka plays a very important role. So this is that part of the temple. Now, above the Amrita Kalasha, next to the Amrita Kalasha, the texts say we should place a flag staff with a flag. Now, why this flag staff and a flag above the Kalasha, which is the Bhumadhya or the center part of the Ajna Chakra of the Prasada Purusha? It is to show that what is inside the Garbhagriha is the Sakara form of that supreme being who is formless. So where is he formless? He is like the Akasha Tattva. Actually, he is a Nirakara Brahma. For common people like us who cannot understand that Nirakara Brahma, realize him, he has taken a form. And to show that this is an endless form, and this is one which always keeps growing. It is not, like stagnant. A flag will not always stay. It is not stagnant. It flies. So to denote this, a flagstaff has to be placed above the prasada. So these are all these are all described in the texts. Now coming to the next aspect of the prasada lakshana, where now the prasada purusha takes various forms. He manifests himself into various forms. So here the prasada purusha, they are usually called as, there are ashta chinhas which are supposed to occur in a prasada. Ashta means 8. Chinhas are usually means they are these symbols. So what are they? See, in a temple when we go, we see a lot of sculptures, lot of decoration. Many times we just feel, they are used for the decorative purpose to attract people or, to show the talent of the sculptor. True, many times it is there, but it's not always the same. Many times it carries more metaphysical, approach towards things. So Granthas say that you should have carvings of creepers and gucha means vegetation. Creepers and vegetation. That is one part. Of the 4, there are 2 duels. The 4 duels constituting this Attachinha. So one set of 2 is Lata and Gucha, meaning that creeper and vegetation. The second set is Deva and Danava aspects. That is, to me, the celestial power, energy, as well as the demonic energy. Then we have Pashu and Pakshi. That is, we have the birds and the animals. Then we have what is called as the Mithuna. Mithuna is the union of a male and female. So this is Mithuna. So these 4 duels constitute the 8 chinna. They have to be carved on the prasada. Now, why do we need this in the prasada? And what does this have to do with the prasada purusha? So this shows the aspects that here the creepers always symbolize, what is called as infinity. It is Sanatana. So the creation, the protection, the destruction, the sthiti, shrishti, sthiti, laya, everything happens continuously. You do not find a stop to it at all. So creepers, you can usually, you cannot find the beginning and end in a creeper. It is very difficult. Somewhere you may try to recognize the beginning, but finding the end is very difficult. So therefore, creepers' crafts, they are so carved in very intricate manner to show that it is something which is eternal. So Srishti Sthiti goes on and goes on and goes on. Now, what is vegetation? Vegetation is the symbolism of life, and that is what comes out of the kalasha or the water. Then we have this Deva and Dhanava. So Deva and Dhanava are nothing but the concepts in human beings. We both have some demonic aspects in us, whereas this is what is described as Sattvika, Rajasika and Tamasika, Trigunas. So with these aspects in a human body, it is likewise, Deva and Dhanava both is necessary. Why? Why is Dhanava necessary there? For negative qualities, for people with negativity, that Dhanava will put them in their place. It should bring to their notice that it is punishable. Just we're going to a temple, you will not become pure, you will not become pious. So you have to be pious with him. So that Danava aspect to control and punish the, the negativity. And Deva, of course, is the benign aspect to shower grace. Then comes Pashu and Pakshi. These are all the aspects of lives, various aspects of life and activity. Because vegetation many times it doesn't denote activity, but Pashu and Pakshi do denote activities. Then comes the ultimate tattva, which is the union of the male and female, that is the Mithana. Now many people misinterpret as erotic sculptures, and why are they shown on the prasada? Why do these sexual sculptures have to do in a temple? That just symbolizes that the Jivatma and Paramatma have to conjugate like a male and female. So why this example of a male and female is the question to be asked. Why should they take this example of a union for explaining, the Jivatma and Paramatma union and Tattva? That is because this is the only time when a human being comes out of all his ego and ahankara, and he doesn't, he gives all the lajja. Lajja means, the shame, everything he gives away and unites with the person. It's because, see, in a parent-children relationship, there are a lot of limitations. In a teacher-student relationship, there are a lot of, of course, in the modern world, there are many immoral things happening, but we should not consider those things while discussing these pious things now. But it is only in the conjugation of, a Sahadharmini and the Pati, where this concept of, crossing all the boundaries happens. So that is how a Jivatma has to approach God. He has to give away his shame, give away his, ego, ahankara. Then reach the Paramatma, the Supreme Lord. So for this understanding, we have to carve these sculptures on the prasada. So this is the symbolism which you find on the prasada, Purusha's body. Then, while coming around the temple, now we have the concept of pradakshina. There are two ways of doing it. That is, we call it as deshachara. Whichever place they may follow, everything is right in its own right. Some people first take 2-3 pradakshinas and then enter the temple. Some people first enter the temple, pray the God, and then take 3 pradakshinas. Either way, it is the same. So, the texts say that you must carve various forms of the Pradhana Devata, the presiding deity. Various forms have to be carved around the Garbhagriha, the Vimana, either on the prasada or on the bichi of the temple or the outer walls. Why should we carve it? Because, see, the deity which is installed in the Garbhagriha is the most supreme soul, who cannot be easily understood, who cannot be easily grasped. So, there are various of his aspects. See, some people who come to the temple may aspire for knowledge. They may aspire for health. They may be very ambitious in life. May it be earning, or may it be, anything for that matter. Unless it is, earning in a dharma, if your earning is guided by dharma, that is also right. And all these things has to be bestowed by the Supreme Being. So therefore, for those people who have the search for knowledge, who have the urge for education, in Indian context, knowledge and education are two separate things. Because education always may not give knowledge, or a person who is knowledgeable may not always be educated. So there are two different things. And the prosperity, energy, health, and all these things. So for this, there are various aspects, again, the symbols of the same deity. For example, if you go to a Vaishnava shrine, we may find a Haigriva Murti, or we may find, Lakshmi Narayana for people who want welfare, Haigriva for people who want education. In Shaiva temples, we may find Dakshinamurti, who is the form of knowledge. Then we have, like Lingodbhava Murti, we have Uma Saita Murti, where, for prosperity. We have Durga. Durga gives us the energy to act. So she instigates the Kriya Shakti. So these are all the minor aspects of the presiding deity which have to be installed around so that when a bhakta or a sadhaka who visits the temple, when he takes the pradakshanas around, he will get blessed by them. And invariably, if you notice, all the deities, not all, but majority of the deities who are installed outside on the, the Bhitti or the Prasada part, they will be in the standing posture to show that we are ready to help you. It is not we are relaxing, we are reclining. No, we are always ready to get into action. So with this symbolism, you have the Sthanaka deities or the minor aspects of the presiding deities installed around the major temple. So these are all the aspects which actually helps to understand the Sukshma Sharira of a temple. So hope I have done some amount of justice to the talk. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take. I'll just want to show you one more slide. See the picture you are seeing now is the plan of a Dravidian structure. The same we can find in the Nagara structures also. See, this is the ground plan, and this is this thing. In texts like Shilparatna Kosha and others of the Nagara style, they associate the same aspects and angas to the temple. And on you can see the Shat Chakras denoted here, and you have the Agna or the Sahasrara in the Garbhanyasa part. So, if there are any questions, I can take.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, the first question we have is pardon. Pardon? If you would want to ask your question.
Pardon?
His name is Pardon, yes.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Am I audible?
Yes, Pardon, you are.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, so when choosing a site to build a temple, who then has the final say to say, this is the place that we are going to build our temple? Is there a person who has a final say, or it will be an agreement among the people? What exactly happened there? That's my question.
So he is asking, is it a person who
I could not very clear.
He's asking if it's a person who decides where the place, a place where the temple is supposed to be established, or is it by consensus? Do a group of people decide it? How is that place actually decided?
Oh, there is actually an entire chapter which is called as Bhumi Nirnaya, dedicated in the Vastu Granthas. That becomes totally a different discussion. However, I'll just give an introduction. There are a lot of quality tests done before the selection of the ground to selections, the stability of the ground, and all those things. Actually, it is a set of experts who do that work. But once they have selected the ground for building the temple, the ritualistic part is done by the Vedic experts who start installing the energy into that portions. Hope I have answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Next up, we have Stone Chichi. You have a question?
Yes, I have a question on the part of the basement of the temple. Who has access to that basement? So that because you said you have to start building on the basement. I just want to know who has access to the basement of the temple. Thank you.
See, the basement of the temple would be covered while installing the votive sculpture or the presiding deity. When it gets installed, the basement would be completely covered. So nobody will have the access to the basement of the temple. But as the deity is installed in the Garbhagriha, which is built above the basement, that Garbhagriha will be accessed by the priests who perform the regular puja.
Okay, thank you so much.
Next up, we have Anthony.
Hello, sir.
Namaste.
Yeah. For lecture. Most of the times when I see most of these designs, I don't know. I just look at the picture. I'm always interested in the design without knowing what is there. And today you have opened my eyes to what I don't see. My question is that in building this temple in India, are all the temples in India built using this particular plan?
Yes, invariably because the temples are built based on one or the other agama. So it is not like building some commercial building at all. Even to this day, there may be some rare stray examples which may go away, but otherwise, if there are well-planned proper temples, even to this day, they are built based on these principles only. I'll tell you one thing, in the contemporary days, they might not be knowing the names of the temple parts or adjuncts which are mentioned in texts like Mayamata or other Kamikagama or Kashyapa Shastra. But the ritualistic part of this, where below the ground installing the energy, they do perform it. Even to this day it happens.
Thank you very much, sir.
Next up, we have Tunde. He has a question.
Yes.
Good evening. Well, it's evening here in Nigeria. I wanted to find out if there's any difference between what you have in India from what you have in Nigeria, because we have a number of temples also in Nigeria, and whether the temples in Nigeria, whether the architecture is different from the ones you have in India.
Okay, I am not much exposed to the architecture of Nigeria, but I can just tell it used to be according to the traditional texts, because in the modern days, as you know, all the constructions are cement built and they're almost same in around the globe. But in ancient India, when the houses were built, the first and primary concern they used to take was the environment surrounding where the house was built. So based on the sunrise, sunset, the amount of sunlight which was required to the house, all these things were calculated and planned. So that is house. And after, from the beginning of even a house or a temple, we have this aspect of associating rituals and energizing the divine powers in that place, in any building for that matter. Even the traditional houses, while they begin plowing the land, they do a puja. Then after the house is built, they have another ritual conducted to energize the place of residence. And actually the text mentioned one more thing. For a temple, every 12 years, you have to re-energize the building. For houses, it has to be done once in 60 years. So the concept is same. And these are the norms followed for building a house and a temple in India. That is the traditional India I'm talking.
Okay, it's quite clear. Thank you so much.
Next question is from Nilofer. Nilofer?
Yeah. Hi, sir. I'm so excited for this meeting. Would you please explain something about Kailasa Temple? It is a very amazing structure, and everybody in all over the world know about it, and many story about this temple, because many people think it is not built by ordinary people. Something like some tale and tell about it, maybe some person far from Earth, and it is not built by ordinary people. Thank you for your response.
Somebody has to,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, sir, she's asking that would you explain about Kailasha temple? She's very much interested in it, and it's beautiful and it's grand. And she's asking if you could explain something about the
Kailashnath, Ellora Kailasa temple.
Nilofer, do you mean Ellora Kailasha temple? Which Kailasha temple?
Yes, yes. My thing is about is we are say Kailasa in I think Laura.
Yes. She means.
Okay. Ellora, actually, it is not a structural. The Kailasa temple of Ellora, it is not a structural temple. So there, it will not begin with the Garbhanyasa. It is not built from below. The construction begins from the upper part, because an entire boulder is wrought into a temple to create the entire temple with one monolithic boulder, a huge boulder. So here what happens is, though it is not structural, they have adopted all the norms according to the structural temple, and after the completion of the temple, wherever the main linga has to be installed, there they have created a Garbhanyasa, and then they have placed a Amrita Kalasha on the top. It is completely after the construction is over. So that is how they do. And this kind of construction is also mentioned in some of the ancient Vastu Granthas like Vishwakarma Vastu Grantha, which deal with the rock cut sanctuaries. There are a lot of rock cut sanctuaries in Western Ghats. So all of these fall under this category, where the structure is planned and done accordingly. There are references to line drawings which they have done before, rotting the stone, before, excavating the rock. We find that. So therefore, the following of the norms are there, but the rituals would be conducted after the completion of the structure. Hope I have answered your question.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Mention.
Okay. So the next question is from Anushri. Her internet is bad, so I will be asking her question. She's asking, is the Sri Padmanabha Swami temple in Trivandrum, is it built on the same lines that you have explained? And her curiosity is hidden, is all the hidden rooms and treasury. My curiosity is all the... Yes, so she wants to understand how Sri Padmanabha Swami temple in Trivandrum, how do you explain how is it built? And her curiosity is about those hidden rooms and treasury that have been found there or is present there.
See, Padmanabha temple I have not personally visited. That is one part, but I have seen the pictures. It is actually a traditional Dravidian temple, regular Dravidian temple of the Chera style. Okay, you must be knowing that Chera, the ruling part in those days of that part. Now, temple surely built on the Tantra aspect of that region. And these rooms which are locked and all, to understand this, you must go through texts like Mayamata, which says that there are a lot of optional features in buildings which can be built according to the requirement. Now, for a small temple, there may be some requirements and not everything would be required. That depends on the place of the temple also. If it's in a capital seat, it will be very richly patronized. So there will be allotment of lot of rooms, lot of, donations would be there. So a lot of people would visit. So big kitchens would be required. So like this. So in Mayamata, you have chapters which deal with Nana Mantapani, to mean that various such mantapas can be built according to the requirements. So whatever the rooms that are locked today and other things, they all fall under this optional category, and that is built according to the requirement. It is not mandatory, but they can be built according to the requirement of the temple and the temple custom. That is how it is explained in the texts also.
Anushri, does that answer your question? I'm sure it does. Her internet's bad. So next up again, we have, thank you so much, sir, for your detailed answer. Next up, again, we have Anthony. He has another very interesting question. I would also want to know about it.
Yes,
Anthony,
sir.
please ask.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much, sir. While you were explaining the question from Mr. Tunde, you said after some years, the temple is usually re-energized. So is it that the energy disappears, that it needs to be re-energized? And also, how is the re-energizing done?
Okay. The re-energizing part is mainly done for few parts. See, what happens, how is the temple energized is the first question. How does it get energized? If you understand that, you will understand why this requirement of 12 years comes. Usually, it is because of the archakas or the people who perform there, based on their, dedication, the amount of, pious behavior they have, with all these things, the chants, constant chants of Veda mantras. For example, Purusha Sukta, Sri Sukta, Devi Sukta, all these things have to be chanted and oblations have to be performed. So when you are performing each and every oblation, that is one aspect you are filling into that into the deity. So therefore, now you fill it and it gets distributed. You fill it and you get distributed. But many times what happens, for various reasons, in between intermediate phases, there may be chances of some of the rituals, they cannot be carried out in the same pace, or so sometimes, there will be some variation. There may be a shift of priests. There may be natural calamities. All these things result in some form of, deviation from the regular routine. This is something which is very natural. To set right all these things, once in 12 years, they do the complete re-energizing part as they do it when installing. Otherwise, the regular things go on. I'll just tell an example. For example, there is a priest who is the chief priest of the temple, and he is doing puja. Now there is a birth or death in his house. Then he cannot enter into the sanctum for 10 to 13 days according to the custom. So 15 days, that is 1 fortnight, he will not be participating in the puja. Now somebody else will have to take his place because the temple puja cannot be stopped. Now the person who takes his place may not be as efficient or as proficient as this person is. So naturally there is some void created. So to separate all these things, once in 12 years, they use this, concept of re-energizing the temple.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. That was super interesting to know. Next up, we have Mukil.
I was thinking why Mukil is silent till now.
I think his internet's not working, or because we can't hear you. Okay, so Mukil's question I'll ask, sir. So he's saying that how do the common people understand these architectural philosophy? Like how do common people understand this architectural philosophy?
See, not always everybody can understand everything. So, but in ancient India, there was a discipline among the visitors of the temple that there are certain things to be followed. So, just to quote few examples, in some temples, they will not prostrate before the Dvajastambha, or they may not, offer something before the Balita. Like this, there have been certain things which common people follow. But the unfortunate thing which has happened in the past 300 years is the common people have been totally disconnected from the regular ritualistic temple activities. Why I am telling this is, till 300-400 years back, people were very much associated with the temple for all the activities, And there used to be regular Harikathas and Purana Vachanas conducted by the temple there. This was a regular activity. That was the entertainment in those days. So if you visit some temples in Hampi, Vijayanagara and all, there are separate mantapas called as Rangamantapas built for this activity. Now what used to happen whenever the common folk visited and they heard these Puranic and Harikathas or other explanation, there they would have heard from the Bhagavatas what are the things which denote what. So they could, to their level, they could understand and they could grasp it. Now what has happened in this 300 years for various reasons, the people who are in the ritualistic side, they are not able to explain why something is done. People who are on the listening side, they also don't get such, are not inquisitive about learning these things. And now the concept of temple has really diluted a lot. So therefore, once the common folk were very much familiar with what had to be done, why they had to do this. So what is very a matter of a common sense among the people. Now it's unfortunate that we have lost the link. That's why various other doubts and arguments are placed when it comes to temple activities and temple culture.
So there's another question. I think this is the last question. If somebody has any more questions, please post in the chat. But this is by Anushri. She's asking, what is the significance of a pond in a temple, in the temple architecture?
It's very simple. Water source. Water is required. Water is always essential. There are 3-4 sources in a temple where the texts mention, and that depends on the region also. See, in places like Rajasthan, or which are less rain-fed and water scarcity places, more importance is given for big tanks and huge lakes associated with the temple. But when it comes to places where the temple itself is on a river bank, then the water sources are comparatively less. But however, to take the purest water for the oblations in the inner sanctum, there would be a well in the premises of a temple, in all the old temples, even if it's on a river bank. So well water is for the purest water for the use of the Garbhagriha. Then of course you need water sources like Pushkarani or other things for the yatrikas who come. For the people who come, they need water. So water source is essential. That is why ponds are associated with temple. There are kupas, vapis, and Pushkaranis mentioned in text. Kupas are wells, vapis are stepped wells, and Pushkaranis are the ponds which are created.
So following this, I have a question. So my understanding of architecture temple is obviously not too much, but there are I think in the Nagara architecture, there are no ponds. So, but in the Dravida architecture, there are ponds, in the sense that is the general rule. So why do both of these north and south architectures, if water is for resources only, then why did not Nagara also had them?
No. I'll tell you, even Matsya Purana, which describes the Nagara temples, mention the requirement of a pond. Now, probably if the Nagara temples are placed on a shore like Konark or something, then you may not get the pure water if you dig a well. River sources are always there, and if they are well fed with rivers, then, but there are Nagara temples. For instance, Kashi Vishweshwara temple has a well in its premises. You must have heard of it. It is called as Gnanavapti. So Vishweshwara temple had a well. It is not that they did not have.
Okay.
And especially many of the temples, they used to have the stepped ponds, because as the water level raises, in rainy season, it used to raise to a higher this thing. So many times it used to go very low. So for this approach, they had stepped ponds. There are temples associated with associated with temple even in Nagara.
Yes, sir. So the next question is by Vineet. His internet is bad, so I will be asking his question. He says that he's asking, is there any connection between the bhava of the deity and the size of the Bali Pitha or the Bali Pitha?
The bhava in the sense, the Sharira bhava, yes. The height of the votive sculpture, the height of the Dhwaja Stambha and the Bali Pitha are related. These are all the information you can call out from texts. It is available. There are chapters like Pithamanam for Bali Pitha and Dhwajamanam which explain this.
Okay, the next, thank you, sir. I think it is clear to me, and I'm sure it is clear to Vineet as well. So the next question up is by Akshay. Akshay?
Yeah, so my question is this: how does the temple architecture affect a person visiting the temple, and how does the bhava of the deity in that temple affect the devotee? Because I have heard that some deities have the Akshay, like Bala Devi and all, whereas some deities have Raudra Bhava. So how does that have effect on the person visiting the temple?
Okay, Akshay, I think there's some connection issue, so we couldn't hear your question. So I will be speaking.
Am I audible?
Akshay, let Abhijit ask. Let Abhijit say, because there's a lot of connection issues on your end.
Okay. So his question is that how does the temple architecture affect a person who is visiting the temple, and how does the bhava of the deity affect the devotee visiting temple? Because he writes, because some deities have bhava of a small child, like Bala Devi, whereas some deities have a Rudra bhav. So that was his question.
Okay. See, there are, first we'll understand the purposes of building the temple also. Now, there are temples where the murtis were usually in Raudra bhavas. They were built by the kings. Many a times they were called as Abhichara Murtis, and they were built in the border regions to protect the kingdom from the enemy forces. So this is one aspect which the Agamas also talk about. If you have to have an Abhichara Murti, how the temple has to be built. And this is to safeguard the kingdom from the external enemies. Now, many times, not all the common people go and visit such temples. It would be only the some particular people who would be appointed for that job. They go, they do the pujas and come. Now, when it comes to the other aspects, there are two ways of looking at how does the votive sculpture influence the sadhaka. Now, people who visit the temple will not be of the same level of spirituality. There may be some people who are very common. So for them, the bhava of the sculpture would usually instigate some kind of emotion in them. So they are common people. So suppose they see a bhava like Bala Devi or Krishna for that matter, they may have this kind of affection or one kind of amusement which keeps them fresh and energetic. That is what they get from that. Now, when they see the fierce form, they may get some kind of fear in them, and this fear would stop them from doing something wrong. Suppose a person visits a temple, sees the Raudra Bhava of the god, the image which he recollects in his mind would naturally create some fear in him, so that he would frequently get that whenever he has an unwanted thought or something like that. So that is for very common people I'm talking. But for sadhakas, all the forms appear the same and they have their own role to play. For example, Raudra Bhavas, if you go deep into the Tantra, you have something like Chinnamasta. The form is very fierce, but the symbolism of Chinnamasta is to just give away our ahankara. So that is why the head is shown as being cut. So if you understand this, the sadhaka would know that. So the form of the Raudra Bhava is not actually Raudra in the destructive mode. It is to have your inner enemies, internal enemies, you have to win over. For that you need that amount of energy. That is why they say winning over one's self is very difficult. So that is where you need a lot of strength. That is how all these symbolism comes. And one more point I would like to add here is, all these things, they get added in a later period when a lot of, vyavaharas enter the sadhanas. That is where all these enter. But when you are stuck to pure Vedanta or pure Sri Vidya, all these things are not necessary.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So then now the next question, I think it is a little off topic. It is by Mukil. He is saying that why in Maya Mata, which is the architectural scripture, there are different dimensions which are mentioned for different castes or varnas during house building process. So that is his question.
If you had attentively heard the Maya Mata lecture, I had answered this. While there was the same question from another person. See, there is something called as material requirement, and the Varnashrama people, they will have some their own limitations. But however, when it comes just not in Maya Mata, even in other granthas, it becomes a bit utpreksha. It is just the vivaranartham, because we cannot take it as that was practice. To quote an example, they say that a Brahmin's house can have 10 stories, but practically no Brahmin will require a 10-storied house or will build a 10-storied house anytime, any day for that matter. So these are all just, like it is in Sanskrit we have a usage called as varnanatmakam, utprekshartham. So that is that. It is not to be very, it is not very applicable.
Okay, sir. So next up we have Amritesh. Amritesh, if your internet's fine, you can please ask your question, or I'll ask it for you then.
Namshwaya, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Sir, actually, how the procedure of this selection of ideal process is done, whether we are going to install a Panchaloka Vigraha or a stone ideal or something called Daru Shilpa. So one based on what procedure it is done.
Okay. Actually, the time is also running out a lot. I think we have passed 10:30 now. But however, I will reply to this question, and the discussion is going way away from the symbolism of the temple. However, see, all these things, you must read the Vastu Granthas like Maya Mata, Kashyapa Shastra, so that you will get answers for all these things. Because now, what is the form of deity you have to install? Is it Shaiva? Should it be a Murti which is a Yoga Murti or Bhoga Murti? And after all deciding it, then you will deciding which should be Mrinmaya or Shila or Panchaloha. Everything is mentioned in the text. So what is your basic doubt in this?
Actually, in some of the temples when I have visited, they have told, yeah, this is made by Daru. So in some of...
This is not clear.
Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
In some of the temples, I have talked to the priest. They have told this is a Daru Shilpa. And in some of the temple, when they will be telling that it is made up of Panchaloha Vigraha here. So any differentiation is there?
See, actually there are various varieties mentioned in the text, like Darumaya, Mrinmaya. Mrinmaya means made out of terracotta or clay. Then you have Shilamaya, and you also have the Loha Pratimas, and various other precious stones also you can use to make. Now, probably you must have been more exposed to the temples of the coastal belt, to which the Kerala tradition also comes under, the Parashurama Kshetra temples. What happens here is the availability of wood is more when compared to the availability of the stone. So therefore, they use more of wood even for votive sculptures, and that is why the same sculpture would not be used for a longer duration when compared to the stone idols. So these are all regional practices. There are Mrinmaya Murtis, and what happens in the Kerala belt or even the coastal belt of Karnataka, we can see that in many temples, for Kollur for that example, the idol Panchala has a very recent addition. The original is something like a linga. So it is only the energy that matters than the morphology. So for them, they used to have any form which could capture the energy. That's all. So that was how the prayers were done. But later on, when people wanted to have the concept of the morphological form, then they started installing the idols of bronze or various other metals. So otherwise, all these are mentioned in the text, everything is, but there is duration and validity for each of them. If it is a Pumshila, if the Murti is made out of a Pumshila, that would last for a long period, like thousands of years. But whereas if it is Darumaya, it has to be renovated frequently, reinstalled frequently. If it is Mrinmaya, it has to be recoated frequently. So all these things happen.
Thank you so much, sir. I'm sure.
Madam, I think we should wind our session now.
Yes, sir. We are winding up the session. Thank you so much, sir, for your really fascinating talk and really insightful talk. And now I will, at least from my side, view temples in a very different way. I've never thought of it like that. So thank you a lot. I'll hand over to Professor Bhavani now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I won't take much more of your time, sir. Thank you so much for spending your very valuable time with us. I'm sure, like Abhijit said, there'll be such a deeper appreciation for our temples, and I will also take the conversation offline with them and take it a little in a more simpler way to again touch upon all the main points that you made in your talk. Thank you very much, sir. Really grateful to you for your time. Thank you. Everybody wants to just quickly turn on your cameras and say bye and thank you.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We appreciate your. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Namaste.
Namaste, sir. Okay. Bye, everyone. See you on Friday.
Bye-bye. Okay, I'm ending now. Namaste.